So I want to thank Bill and Rick and others who have written to ask the question, what do you mean when you say the Gospels were lost for 900 years? Okay, um, this is an enormous topic, but let me give you sort of the touchstones as we build to a completely different understanding of the Gospels than what's the common view today. In the first centuries of Christianity, our ancestors assumed the way as a defined four paths from our Jewish ancestors. So that when Jesus, Yeshua, talks about the way, this is not just following Jesus, it's an identifiable path. Christians put this path into the sequence of Sunday worship in the first century. They put this path into the way you prepare a person for baptism beginning in the second century. And they put this path into changing the shape of the cross from the historical shape of 3 points to the shape of 4 points. And this pattern led them to the choice of the gospel in 4 chapters. And this is sort of core to all of my work, that they were not choosing, as is commonly believed today, 4 different witnesses of Jesus. No, they were choosing the 4 texts that, when put together in a certain sequence, are Jesus leading us through the 4 paths, which are the great journey of growth and transformation that we are constantly going through. And after, or almost really at the same time that the 4 texts are named, they also are set into a 3-year Sunday reading cycle. So every Christian from late 3rd century into the 7th century on Sunday are going to hear the entirety of the 4 Gospels in a particular sequence. Year 1, you read Matthew. Year 2, you read Mark. Year 3, you read Luke. And every Lent and Easter, you read John, because John, even by the 2nd century, had already become the text of Lent Easter, another topic that we could discover. All right. Then comes this moment in the 7th century, the 600s. Something happened. And the 3-year cycle of reading the Gospels is set aside. And what replaces it is a 1-year telling of the life of Jesus. 60 passages were chosen from the 4 Gospels. And this is what people heard on Sunday. They heard the same passage of Jesus's life on the same Sunday every year. So this starts late 600s, early 700s. I think it happened because the Roman Empire had crumbled. Civilization was really very poorly organized. Churches now were hospitals, schools, and police stations. There was very little education. People could not largely read or write. And so the only way they could know the story of Jesus is what they hear in church on Sunday. And all they are hearing are 60 passages from the 4 Gospels. That's roughly 1 passage a Sunday, 52 Sundays, and then you add in the great feasts. So roughly we've got 60 stories of Jesus. This goes on for 900 years. Yes, the full gospel manuscripts are in the monastery libraries, but education was so poor, and people had come to think that We didn't need all of that added information. All we needed are these 60 stories of Jesus. But what happened when you just have 60 stories, you no longer know that the four Gospels form a complete, continuous story. The discrepancies between the Gospels are absolutely vital to our understanding of how to walk each path of the way. But now all of that was lost in the gospel text. And so when Martin Luther and John Calvin, near the time of the Gutenberg printing press, when their work returned the entirety of the four gospels to all the people at a moment that people could now read and write more, could have a Bible in their homes to read and study. It's like, oh my gosh, look, we have all of these more stories of Jesus. And they had no way to know that the four stories were linked together in a sequence, which was Jesus showing us how to live the four paths. And so now, from Martin Luther and Calvin to the 1960s of the last century, that's been the prevailing notion, that the Gospels are the great, holy, sacred story of Jesus. Totally lost that the pattern is greater than the individual story. And as I know from my work, patterns are more true than individual pieces of information. The individual pieces of information don't give us context. Patterns give us context. And so starting in the 1960s, when the Roman Catholic Church went back into its voluminous library and realized there was all this documentation on how we came to choose four Gospels and adhere them to a certain sequence, and brought that back to us in the late 60s with the 3-year Sunday reading cycle of the Gospels on Sunday morning, and then the Anglican, Episcopal, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodists by the 1990s. All of the mainline Christian traditions had restored the 3-year cycle. But still, until the work of Quadratos, we have not understood that the cycle is a pattern, and that pattern sets the context for the choice and the sequencing. That the four Gospels are not only the great sacred story of Jesus. Actually, it's one gospel in 4 continuous chapters, which show us how to live, pray, and walk the 4 paths. Okay, I hope that this might have helped you a little bit. I realize this is an enormous story, and I realize that we're just now beginning to realize a critical piece of gospel that was left behind about 1,400 years ago. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we need scholarship far better than mine to fill in the missing pieces of this greater story. Not 4 gospels, one gospel in 4 chapters. Matthew leads to Mark, Mark leads to John, John leads to Luke, Luke, Acts, bends back around to Matthew. Thanks for the question.